Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are taking a slightly overdue look at the Just Flight Warrior. Unfortunately I couldn't bring you this review as soon as I would have liked, as real life got in the way. Also not helped by the fact that I've had to record this review on 3 separate occasions, although worth stating that's nothing to do with the aircraft itself. Anyway, we are finally able to get the Warrior back up in the air and take her for a bit of a flight. And today we'll be taking the aircraft from White Waltham, where we're currently parked, over to Popham. Both pieces of scenery that you'll see in the video are from Burning Blue Designs. We will be coming back and taking a closer look at both airfields at a later date on the channel, but today obviously the focus is the Warrior itself. I have to say that I've been quite looking forward to the arrival of the Warrior in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I know that some of you feel you're well catered for now in terms of the PA-28 family, but I personally have a little bit of a soft spot for the aircraft, having flown it many years ago. And I do think that the low cruising speed and relative simplicity of the Warrior tends to lend it its own certain charm. Given that I have flown the Warrior previously, I'll try and give you my feedback based on the real world aircraft, but it is worth mentioning that my memories are a little bit hazy and most of the information I'll be giving you here is purely qualitative. As always guys, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comments section below. Anyway, let's continue on with the review, starting with a closer look at the external model of the aircraft. So once again, when it comes to the external modelling, I think that Just Flight have done a really nice job with their Warrior. The level of quality seems to be very much on a par as we saw with their Arrow series of aircraft. Again, it has been some time since I flew the Warrior, and often many of you are better at picking out the finer details than I am, but certainly the airframe looks very much as I remember. Everything looks to be proportioned quite nicely, and I couldn't find any significant areas that really fell down in terms of the modelling detail. As with the Arrow family, and indeed most add-on aircraft now in the sim, we get a series of external fixtures and fittings. Here you can see we have the tie-downs fitted to the aircraft, but we also have the option to fit chocks and an aircraft tow bar. Again, as with the Arrow family, I think it's fair to say that the texturing looks really nice from a distance, very authentic. But if we do get up a little bit closer with the aircraft, you can see that some of the texturing is not quite up to the same resolution as we're now used to in the sim. For example there, the logos on the propeller not particularly easy to read, and we are now seeing textures in the sim on other aircraft where you can read every single individual letter. Overall though, I think the texturing is very nice. I think that Just Flight have created a decent balance between the aircraft looking used, but not looking too clapped out. For example here you can see a little bit of oil staining there on the engine cowling. And again, even in the more hidden away areas, the modelling is pretty nice, but the texturing just a little bit on the lower resolution side. As I often mention in my reviews though, personally I don't really mind seeing low resolution textures on areas of the aircraft which you're rarely going to see in flight. So once again, as far as the external modelling goes, a big thumbs up from me on the Just Flight Warrior. The texturing is certainly more than adequate, whilst it could be a little bit higher resolution. At a distance I think the aircraft looks really nice. As you can see, today we'll be taking out Golf Oscar Papa Tango India for our flight. From memory, I think that the package comes with around 5 or 6 real-world liveries, as well as the option to have one of those liveries with your own custom registration. Once again though, I would love it if we had the option to have a custom registration on each of the available liveries. As I've said now in a number of my Just Flight aircraft reviews, I really miss not having the custom registration. I think most of us have now got used to it in the sim. It's obviously not a massive deal in terms of the enjoyment of flying the aircraft, but it's just a nice little touch to have. Lastly, you can see the cockpit as viewed externally certainly looks rather nice. It does bring back a few memories for me, and as usual the cockpit is really the tour de force in the Just Flight PA-28 series. So we'll head inside and take a closer look at that. As I say, on the outside of the aircraft there are just a few little areas that you could potentially pick fault with. Internally though, as ever, I think that Just Flight have done an absolutely wonderful job with the modelling and the texturing of the Warrior's cockpit. Overall I think it looks really authentic, and as you can see both the texturing and the colouring as well looking really good. Coming up closer into the instrument panel, and the detailing is still all there. Maybe some of the text on the panel itself could just be slightly higher resolution, but the gauges are an absolute work of art. They're really nicely done, very crisp, very detailed, and as you'll see later on in the flight, very fluid as well. And I know that wear and tear often divides opinion, but I think that Just Flight always do a really nice job of weathering the cockpit. Coming down into the footwell, and again the level of detail pretty good overall, especially given that it's a much more hidden away area of the cockpit. Texturing and modelling still done to a very nice standard. And again, if we were being picky, we could say that the carpet texturing is a little bit lower resolution than we've seen from some other aircraft in the sim. But I think that Just Flight more than make up for that by getting the wear and tear and the various dirt and debris on the floor there pretty much spot on. The rear of the cabin is also very nice. It's not breaking any boundaries in terms of texturing or modelling, but it's certainly more than adequate, and it's not an area of the aircraft that I'm personally too fussed about. It was pointed out to me in my preview of the aircraft that the rear seats of the Warrior are perhaps inaccurate. Again, I can't remember exactly what the rear seats of the aircraft look like, but it does seem, looking online, that it's more of a bench configuration generally speaking. That being said, I can neither confirm nor deny whether this particular configuration is accurate to the real-world aircraft. Just Flight do tend to model their GA aircraft based on real-world airframes, so it's quite possible that this is a real-world configuration. And lastly, a very quick look at the night lighting. Overall, I think quite nicely done, as you can see. We have two separate rear stats, both for the instrument lights and the radio stack lighting, as well as an overhead red dome light, which again we have a rheostat, so you can adjust the intensity of that. So overall, the internals of the cockpit, particularly the main instrument panel, get a huge thumbs up from me. As with the arrows, I really like what Just Flight have done with the Warrior, and I like as well that they do at least take the time to texture the aircraft differently from variant to variant. Obviously there is a lot of commonality between the various members of the PA-28 family, and whilst I'm sure that some assets do get reused, they do at least go to the effort of making the aircraft feel a little bit different from its counterpart. So once again, the Warrior comes fitted with the custom Just Flight EFB. The tablet has much the same functionality as we've seen on the Just Flight Arrow family, so we'll just briefly look through the options and discuss any significant changes as we go. Firstly, we have our aircraft states. You can select from a cold and dark, ready for start or ready for takeoff state, and we do now also have some nice audio cues to make it very clear which state you've selected.
Cold and dark selected.
Below that we have our maintenance panel. You can enable or disable the various failure functions that have been modelled on the aircraft. You can also refill the aircraft oil and recharge the aircraft battery, and as you can see we also have various warnings about the aircraft's current state. Below that we have an option to enable or disable the visual model of the co-pilot within the virtual cockpit. Next we have our aircraft options. We have the ability to turn on or off the auto fuel selector. This will automatically periodically switch between the aircraft's two fuel tanks and therefore balance the tanks without pilot input. Next we have the option to change out various avionics equipment within the aircraft. As you can see we're currently sporting the Garmin GPS 100 unit, but we can also switch that out for a dual GNS setup. And again we now have some nice sounds associated with the switch. So here we have the dual GNS 530 and GNS 430. Here we have a single GNS 530 with a more traditional radio stack by the side. And lastly we can select the PMS GTN 750 if you have that downloaded. Below that we have state saving, so you can switch that on or off to have a persistent state aircraft. And lastly with our aircraft options we can choose between a directional gyro or HSI on the main instrument panel. So for today's flight we'll go with the GPS 100 and the directional gyro, as I think that's the most typical sort of setup you'd see on your average Flying Club Warrior. Below that we have the ability to toggle the yokes on and off via the EFB, but we can also do that just by clicking on the yoke, as you might expect. In terms of aircraft equipment, you've probably already seen some of that from the external shots, but we have chocks, tie downs and a tow bar, again similar to the Arrow. The only different option here is we have the ability to turn on or off the wheel fairings on the aircraft. Obviously the Warrior has a fixed gear, and we'll be turning off the wheel fairings for today's flight, as I've just always preferred the aesthetic of the Warrior without the wheel fairings. Typically as well you might want to remove the fairings if you're commonly landing and taking off on unprepared strips. Lastly, in terms of our options, we have the doors page, where we can select to open the cabin or the baggage door, but similarly, once again, if you wish, you can just click on the door to operate the function. Lastly, we have a little flight computer with various information available to us. As you can see, we have the headwind component, crosswind component, TAS, track and drift. We also have our density and pressure altitude, our fuel used, our nautical miles and statute miles per gallon. And on the last page we have range in various units, endurance in hours and minutes, and our ground speed in various units as well. So that's all the options available to us with the Just Flight EFB. If we want to turn the tablet off, that's very easy to do. We can just click on the button. And if, like me, you don't really like having the tablet in the cockpit itself, again, very easy to remove. You can just click on the intercom button to remove it altogether. Anyway, that just about wraps up the external and internals of the aircraft, as well as the EFB functionality. I'm sure, like me, you're very keen to see the aircraft airborne, see how it flies, see what the systems are like. So we'll get ourselves comfy in the left-hand seat, and we'll get the aircraft started up. So, welcome on board the Just Flight Warrior. We've just got ourselves comfortable, so the first thing we'll do, we'll get the cockpit door closed up. And make sure it's secure. And now I'm conscious that you've probably seen me run through the before start checks of a PA-28 a significant number of times now, so we'll try and make it a fairly abbreviated startup. So the internal checks, mobile phones are off, passenger brief is not required, seats are adjusted and locked, hatches and harnesses are secure, parking brake is set, radios are off, flight instruments are checked, flight controls are full free and in the correct sense, trims are set, flaps just checking the flaps and stages, and the flaps are checked, they can go back to the up position. Cabin air controls are off, fuel will come on to the left tank for the start, the tank should be pretty evenly balanced. For the start itself, throttle is full and free, and we'll crack it about half an inch. Mixture can go to the fully rich position. Throttle friction is set. Carb heat is full and free and set to cold. Master switch can come on. Circuit breakers are checked in. Beacon can come on. Fuel pump is checked. We have fuel pressure. And we can prime the engine, so we'll unlock the primer. It's a cold start, but it's a fairly warm day here, so we'll just prime 3 times. So there's our 3, we'll lock the primer again. Checking the prop area. It is clear. Clear prop! I'm going to engage the starter. So we have the starter warning light. And a good engine start. We'll adjust the throttle to maintain about 1200 RPM. Oil pressure has come up into the green. And the after start checks, throttle is set, brakes are holding, starter warning light is out, oil pressure is checked, ammeter is checked, suction is checked, magnetos are checked and back to both, flight instruments, so the altimeter is set, directional gyro, we're showing a heading there of about 274. Versus 274 on the compass. We'll set the heading bug as well. Our heading out to the first waypoint will be 215. And that is set. And the rest of the instruments look good. Avionics master can come on. We'll get the COM1 radio on as well. That's really all we'll need for today's flight. And we'll tune that up to traffic, which is 122.9. Transponder can go to standby. And we are now ready for the taxi. So we'll call up traffic, we'll be departing off runway 25 right.
Echo Golf Lima Mike traffic Piper Golf. India Tango Bravo Sierra is taxiing to runway 25 right.
So 25 right's pretty much straight off the nose. The threshold's roughly at our 1 o'clock. Nice short taxi for us. Park brake can come off. There's not really much wind around today, so we took 25 right, mainly because it's roughly in our departure direction. But as there's not too much wind around, we're not going to worry about getting the aircraft pointed into wind for the run-up. Just get ourselves pointed at the threshold and hold there. You can see the holding point sign for runway 25. And here's runway 25, so we'll just bring the aircraft to a stop. Park brake can come on. We didn't get too much of a chance to test it there obviously, but overall the Warrior handles very nicely on the ground. It's again much the same as the Arrow. and broadly in line with what you would expect from the real aircraft. Anyway, for the power checks, we are into wind, effectively. Parking brake is on. Throttle is set at 1200 RPM. Fuel, we'll change over the tanks. And we'll note down the time, it's 2:1, we'll note that on the fuel log. Engine temperatures and pressures, all within limits. All temperatures still coming up there at the moment. So we'll come up to 2000 RPM on the throttle. Making sure that the brakes are holding. And there's our 2000 RPM, we'll check the magnetos. So onto the left. And there's about a 80 RPM drop there on the left, back to both. And now onto the right. And we have about the same drop on the right. And again back to both. So RPM's good, we'll do a carb heat check. And about a 50 RPM drop there with the carb heat. That can go back to the cold position. Engine temperatures and pressures are checked, ammeter is checked, and the suction gauge is checked. We'll come all the way back to idle on the throttle. And we should see the engine idling around 500 to 700 RPM. And it looks like we're idling there around 750, which is close enough. So back up to 1200. The before takeoff checks, the trim is set for takeoff, throttle friction has been set, mixture is in the fully rich position, magnetos are on both, master switch is on, pitot heat is on, primer is in and locked, fuel. So the tanks are pretty evenly balanced, we've got about 20 US gallons on board and we are on the right tank. Fuel pressure is good. Fuel pump can come on. Flaps, we won't need any flaps for the takeoff today, we've got plenty of takeoff run available. Just quickly scanning over the gauges once again. Showing about 330 on the directional gyro, same on the compass, altimeter looks good. So gauges are checked, hatches are secure. Harnesses are secure, carburetor heat is in the cold position, flight controls. They're once again in the full free and correct sense. Transponder can go to out. And the landing light can go on. So we are now ready for the takeoff. Looks to be all clear on final. And the same on upwind, we'll call traffic and tell them we're departing out to the south.
Echo Golf Lima Mike traffic Piper Golf, India Tango Bravo Sierra taking off runway 25 right departure to the south.
So part brake off. Taxi ourselves onto runway 25 right. And then we'll just hold briefly. So it is runway 25 right confirmed. And we'll just briefly bring the aircraft to a stop. So we are all set and ready to go. As I say, initially we're looking for a heading of 215 on the departure. That'll take us out towards our first waypoint. And it'll be quite a quick hop over towards the first waypoint, only a leg of around 3 minutes. Departure time 3.5, so expecting to arrive around 3.8. Feet are off the brakes, we'll slowly come up to full power. So there's full throttle, RPM looks good, T's and P's are in the green. Coming back on the stick. Aircraft feeling a little bit nose heavy, but we're off the ground. We'll pitch for a climb of around 70 knots. Already up through 300 feet, the flaps are up, the gear of course is fixed. The initial climb performance does feel a little bit sprightly compared to the real world aircraft. Anyway, we're up through 500 feet, so we'll start our turn now onto our heading. Using a little bit of right rudder here to keep the ball centred on the turn and slip indicator. Says a heading of 215. And more or less trim now for our climb at 70 knots. We'll climb up to an altitude of around 2,500 feet. That should keep us nicely below the cloud layer. So we've got full power. As you can see, we're climbing around 70 knots. We're doing a vertical speed there of around 1,300 feet per minute, which, as I say, from memory seems a little bit high for the Warrior. We are fairly light though. We've only got one person on board, of course, and around 50% of our maximum fuel load. Overall though, the aircraft feels very nice to fly. On the takeoff, the rudder response is reasonable, perhaps just a touch oversensitive, but that of course tends to be a sim issue as opposed to an aircraft issue. But in roll and in pitch it's very nice to hand fly. It certainly doesn't feel overly sensitive, it feels quite stable as well. And we're just coming up on 2,500 feet, so we'll lower the nose. Let the speed build up to around 90 knots and then we'll come back on the power. And easing off on that rudder input as well. There's 90 knots. Go for about 2,200 RPM in the cruise. And you can already see the first waypoint right off the nose. We'll just swing out to the right slightly, just to put the waypoint on our left wing. So still trimming for pitch here at the moment. We're almost trimmed off now. Power looks good. We're in the cruise, so we'll get the fuel pump off, as well as the landing lights. The aircraft does feel a little bit left wing heavy. It definitely wants to drop the left wing somewhat, so we'll just trim that out using a little bit of rudder trim. That left wing tendency just a bit heavier than I remember in the real world aircraft. So 2,200 RPM trimmed out here in the cruise. As you can see, we're doing just a touch over 95 knots there, a little less than 100. So the cruise speed seems reasonable. Again, perhaps just a touch higher cruise speed there than the real aircraft. Anyway, here's the intersection between the two stretches of motorway, as you can see, just passing down below us. We've got the town of Wokingham just off on our left, and Reading just down on our right. Next waypoint is the town of Basingstoke, so we'll turn now to a heading of 223. We'll set that on the heading bug. And it'll be a 9-minute leg out towards Basingstoke, so expecting to arrive at time 4:08. Once again, the aircraft very pleasant to hand fly. And we're nicely trimmed now here in the cruise. We're maintaining altitude, so we'll just get the autopilot in for the next stretch, really just to give it a little bit of a test. The Just Flight Warrior actually has quite a capable autopilot given the nature of the aircraft. We'll go into heading, we'll get the autopilot on. We also have an out hold mode just by hitting this little white button on the top right of the autopilot unit. And as you can see, that will hold the heading bug and our current altitude. So we have a heading hold, a nav hold, an approach hold, and also a reverse back course approach hold. So all in all, the aircraft's actually quite a capable one, especially given that we have the option to change out various units in the avionics suite. Anyway, as I say, we'll cruise our way down towards Basingstoke. It'll be about another 8 minutes here. As usual, we'll head outside the aircraft, take in a little bit more of the external model now that we're in the cruise, and I'll come back to you again once we're over the town and ready for our approach into Popham. So welcome back. As you can see, we are now over the town of Basingstoke, and you can see the motorway just out to the southeast. We'll turn on our heading towards Popham, which is a heading of 232. And once again there you can see the autopilot doing a nice job of tracking the heading bug. We'll tune up the tower. Unfortunately we will have to do that with the air traffic menu as we have the older avionics units fitted, so we're not going to be able to manually tune the frequency. We won't call the tower just yet, we'll be carrying out a few manoeuvres before we land at Popham, but you can just about make out where the airfield is, just off the nose. Anyway, that's about enough of letting the autopilot fly the aircraft, so we'll disengage. We'll do a bit more manual flying. And we'll just head out towards the west away from Basingstoke. We'll find ourselves a little bit of clear airspace. We'll carry out a couple of manoeuvres, as I say, before we land. Namely, we'll look to carry out a power on stall and then a steep turn, just to get a little bit of a feel for the aircraft's flight model. Obviously both of those manoeuvres are quite commonly carried out during flight training in the Warrior. But again, overall the aircraft is very pleasant to hand fly, it's very stable. And it certainly isn't going to get you anywhere quite as quickly as the Arrow members of the family, but it is quite nice and certainly has its own charm cruising around at 90 knots. Really gives you more of an opportunity to take in the scenery, which, as I always say, is particularly nice, of course, in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So, Popham just off at our 10 o'clock at the moment. A little bit tricky to make out at the moment, perhaps. Basically where the motorway starts to kink back round to the south, the airfield just off to the right of the kink there in the road. Anyway, we're just coming over the edge of the town, so we'll carry out our hassle checks before we carry out the stall. So height, we're currently at 2,500 feet, which is a little bit low to be carrying out the stall, but we're going to trade some of this airspeed for altitude in the manoeuvre, so we'll gain some more height as we go. Airframe, the flaps are up, the gear is obviously fixed. Security, hatches and harnesses are secure, there's no loose objects in the cabin. Engine, so T's and P's looking good, we'll do a quick carb icing check. Doesn't appear to be any carb icing, so the carb heat can go back to cold. Location. So we are now clear of the town. We're clear of any significant built up areas and we're clear of any airspace. And lastly a lookout. So we'll have a really good lookout, make sure there's no aircraft around us. And it does indeed appear to be clear. So we'll head towards this gap in the clouds. As I say, we'll first carry out a power on stall. So it's full power. Coming back on the stick, letting that speed bleed off, trading it for some altitude and some climb performance initially. So up through 3,000 feet now, that'll give us plenty of time to carry out our stall. Continuing to come back on the stick, speed back through 75 knots. There's 70 knots. And 65. The aileron's just starting to feel a little bit mushy now. There's 60. Almost full back stick. There's 55. And now we have full back stick. So we've got full back stick here at the moment, full power obviously, and as you can see, pretty high nose attitude, but the aircraft not really wanting to stall, we're just mushing up and down between 55 and 60 knots. And that does seem to be fairly characteristic of the Just Flight Warrior. It's actually quite difficult to induce a stall in the aircraft. What I find is we actually need to use some aft elevator trim as well to really get the nose up and force the aircraft to stall. So coming back now on the elevator trim, there's the stall warning as you can hear. A little bit of buffeting there now as well. And the left wing wanting to drop. Into the stall we go. Actually quite a violent spin. And the aircraft recovering fairly quickly there. So coming fully forward on the stick, having to trim forward as well just to keep the nose down. That spin will develop if you keep the controls fully back. Now we'll just get the aircraft levelled off again. Once we're nicely trimmed in level flight, we'll do our steep turn. So overall, I think it's actually a little bit difficult to induce the spin in the aircraft. Obviously the Warrior is a training platform, so its stall characteristics are rather state, but I do seem to recall it was easier to induce a stall than that. And once you induce the stall, generally the nose will just drop on you. It's actually not particularly easy to get the Warrior to spin. Again, if memory serves me correctly. So I think the stall characteristics do need a little bit of work, although once we actually got the aircraft to stall, I think the response is reasonable, and the spin's certainly quite nice. You do have to carry out the correct drills to actually get the aircraft to recover from the spin. Anyway, we're back at 90 knots now, power is good, more or less trimmed for straight and level flight, so we'll carry out our steep turn. We'll just get ourselves pointed away from the clouds and back towards the airfield before we do that. And again, really enjoying hand flying the aircraft, I have to say. I think it's actually very pleasant, very good fun. Try and keep away from the airfield as well while we carry out our manoeuvres. That's still off in the distance at the moment, just passing off the nose. About now. We're in a little bit of cloud here at the moment, so we'll just descend, lose some altitude, get back below the cloud layer. Take the carb heat as we come off the throttle. And you can see Basingstoke again off the nose. So this puts us into a nice little patch of clear airspace. We'll come off the carb heat again. Once again get the aircraft levelled off. Back down at 3,000 feet now. And there's our 2200 RPM. Having a good look out again just before we start the turn. So as I say, we'll make our steep turn out to the left. So banking over to the left, coming up on the power to maintain the speed. Do a 60-degree bank turn. And coming back on the stick to maintain the altitude. Losing a little bit of altitude initially there in the turn, so coming back on the stick some more. Overall, I have to say the aircraft feels pretty good in the steep turn. Control movements are about what I would expect. It is a little bit of a handful to maintain our altitude, which is always the tricky part of a steep turn, particularly if, like me, you're a little bit out of practice. Yeah, overall, as I say, I think quite a decent effort there from Just Flight on the flight model. The steep turn certainly well within the bounds in terms of how the aircraft feels. So we'll just head back towards the north initially. We'll call up the tower, request an approach, and then we'll head back towards the airfield once we know what we're doing.
Tower Piper Golf, India Tango Bravo Sierra, 4 miles north, 2,900 feet to land. Piper Golf, India Tango Bravo Sierra Tower. QNH 29er, 2 wind 272 at 8. Fly right base runway 26. Enter right base runway 26 Piper Tango Bravo Sierra.
Okay, so they want us in for a right base onto runway 26, which is great. That's the runway we wanted. That's by far the most interesting runway to come in on at Popham. You'll see what I mean in a few moments' time. So we've got the airfield just off at our 2 o'clock.
Cleared to land runway 26. Cleared to land runway 26 Piper Tango Bravo Sierra.
So we are clear to land. The altimeter is set. We've got the carb heat on again as we're just going to come back on the throttle. Start our descent. Get our downwind checks out of the way. So brakes are tested and off. Undercarriage is down. Mixture is rich. Fuel pump can come on. Fuel quantities are checked and sufficient. We'll come back onto the left tank for the approach and landing. Instruments are checked Landing light can come on, harness is secure. So Popham's just off the nose. We do have one of the runways roughly in line with the aircraft, but we're landing runway 26, which as you can see we're coming in roughly on a right hand base here at the moment. As I say, Popham runway 26 is a really interesting little approach. It's almost like the GA equivalent of coming into Kai Tak. You can't actually fly down the runway extended centre line for the approach due to various obstacles. So what we actually do is come in at quite an acute angle. We follow some markers over the ground, and then we turn very last minute onto final for runway 26. Anyway, for now we'll just continue to descend at 90 knots. We'll start slowing up very shortly. Just about make out the leader marker there for the runway. It's probably a little bit difficult for you to see at the moment, but it's right off the nose. We'll start reducing our airspeed, taking some flap. Get the airspeed back to around 80 knots for now. A little bit of a balloon there as the flaps come out, that feels good. And just coming through 1,000 feet. So you can probably just make out runway 26 now. As you can see, we're actually coming in at quite an angle onto the runway. Go full flaps now. Let the speed come back to around 65 knots for the approach. Carry just a few extra knots for the turn. Carb heat can go away. So pitch is full fine, undercarriage is down, flaps are set, landing clearance has been received, the runway is clear. You can just see the leader marker down there below the nose, and it almost looks like we have our own checkerboard there for the approach as well. And you can see the obstacles just passing off the left wing. So turning around onto final, coming off the power. Holding the aircraft off. There's touchdown. Now we'll start braking. We'll try and vacate off on the first right exit.
Tango Bravo Sierra turn, next taxiway.
So not too bad of a landing overall. As I say, a really fun approach into Popham, and I really love the scenery, I have to say. It's a really nice airfield from Burning Blue Designs.
Contact ground on 129.805. 129.805 for Piper Tango Bravo Sierra.
We won't contact ground, we'll just find our way over to a vacant parking spot. As I was saying, it's probably my favourite scenery over there so far, just because Popham is such a fun little airport to operate into. Anyway, we'll get the flaps up. Transponder can come off. As can the fuel pump and the landing lights. Same for the pitot heat. We'll just swing the aircraft around in this little spot here. Making sure we've got good clearance on the wingtip. And we'll get ourselves parked up. So on the brakes, park brake can come on. Bring the throttle back to idle around 1200 RPM. After landing checks, carburetor heat is set cold, flaps are up, trims are set to neutral, throttle friction has been adjusted. Fuel pump is off, electrics are off, We'll get the avionics master off as well. And the same for our COM1 radio there. Radios are off, transponder is off. And for the shutdown, parking brake is set, throttle is set. Check the magnetos. So mags are good. Radios are off. We'll come back on the mixture to idle cutoff. And we have a good shutdown. We'll close the throttle. Mags can come off. All of our electrics except for the anti-collision light are off. Master switch can come off. As can the fuel. We'll get the anti-collision light off. And we'll open up the cockpit door. And that is the shutdown checklist complete. So as usual, to finish up the review, I'll try and give you my overall thoughts and opinions on the product, what I think's good, what I think's bad. And as usual, we'll start with the bad points and work our way through to the good. I think the simplest way to sum up the Warrior is that it's very much on a par with the Just Flight Arrow. So if you're familiar with that aircraft, then you can very much expect a product of the same quality. That being said, I did find a few negative issues with the aircraft, although most of them are fairly trivial in nature. Starting with the flight model, and again this is very qualitative, so if anyone has any differing opinions, please let me know down in the comments. Personally, I thought that the aircraft just overperformed slightly, particularly in the climb after departure. The cruise speed also seemed to be a few knots faster than I recall for the real-world aircraft. I don't think it was anything huge in terms of deviation from the real-world numbers, but noticeable nonetheless. And similarly, the left-wing down tendency in the cruise seemed to be a little bit overdone. As we saw as well, I think the low-speed handling characteristics of the aircraft just need tweaking a little bit. Very hard to get the aircraft to stall at the moment. And whilst the Warrior is a training aircraft designed to be very sedate in the stall, I certainly don't remember it being quite as hard to induce the stall as I found it here. Those are my only real major gripes with the flight model though. Overall I have to say, once again, the aircraft flies very nicely. It did feel fairly reminiscent of flying the Warrior, and again it's a joy to hand fly. It's a very stable, very pleasant platform. In terms of the texturing, I think we've already covered that, but some of the external textures could be slightly higher in resolution. This is definitely a pattern with Just Flight aircraft though, and it may be that it's a conscious choice on their part, just to help save a little bit on the FPS. The rest of my negative points for the aircraft are really just minor niggles, but we'll run through them nonetheless. So there were a few little attentions to detail that I found lacking on the aircraft, although I'm sure that Just Flight will be very quick to patch this up, as they have been with the Arrow series. Things such as the aircraft wheel fairings being selected on or off, they weren't saved as part of the persistent state. The EFB, sometimes I was able to turn that on without the battery and the avionics master being on other occasions I wasn't. Obviously, in reality, the EFB is going to be running off its own power supply, so I think you should be able to operate that without the aircraft being powered. And similarly, the EFB battery life is incredibly short, probably in the order of around 30 minutes. Given that the average battery life of a real-world tablet is probably in the order of around 12 hours. Personally, I think if anything, Just Flight should go the other way and give the tablet an infinite battery life. Custom registrations, again we've already touched on this, but I would really like to see the option to have custom registrations on all of the liveries available. I'm afraid I'm going to keep beating that one with a stick. I think it's a really nice option in the sim. It makes the aircraft feel more personalised to you as well. And the last issue that I noticed was with the aircraft's lighting. On a couple of flights, it seemed that if I operate the lights manually, I was getting no lighting effects on the external model, whereas if I used the Ready for Start option via the EFB, then the lights were showing up. So potentially a little issue that needs fixing up there as well. So overall, there were a few minor bugs, as really you'd expect to see from any product on release. Again though, I will give Just Flight credit where it's due. They've been incredibly proactive with patching up the Arrow family. Not only have really all of the issues been fixed up with that aircraft, but the aircraft's also come a long way since its release. And so I would hope and really expect to see the same treatment with the Warrior. Before we move on to the good, we'll just touch on the aircraft's FPS, as really it's neither good nor bad. Generally, I found I was losing about 13 FPS versus the default Cessna 152. So you will take a little bit of an FPS hit with the Just Flight Warrior, but it's certainly competitive with other aircraft add-ons in the sim. Anyway, moving on to the good, and once again I thought that the external modelling was very nice. The internal modelling and texturing, really top notch. I really like the feel that Just Flight create with their aircraft, particularly in the cockpit. Systems wise, all very good, again very much on a par with the Arrow series. And flight model, again it did have a few issues, but overall I think Just Flight have done a very nice job of recreating the feel of the Warrior. Nice to see that once again we do have the option to switch out various avionics units, and once again the autopilot provided with the Warrior seemed to be very capable. So whilst the aircraft is a little bit slower for those long cross-country flights, you'll certainly be able to sit back, relax and enjoy the scenery should you wish. The sounds of the aircraft, which we haven't really touched on yet, but once again they were absolutely excellent, both the external and internal sounds. Once again the engine sounds really good from Just Flight, and all of the little switch clicks, control noises, creaks and groans of the aircraft, again going a long way to make the whole aircraft feel much more alive and immersive. In terms of VR, the aircraft also very nice, and specifically the VR zoom function does seem to work. So once again I think that overall Just Flight have produced a really lovely product in their Warrior. Obviously the aircraft does have a lot in common with the PA-28 Arrow, the Warrior being slower and obviously having a lot less up its sleeve in terms of performance. But as I say, overall I think it does have its own unique charms, and certainly if you've flown the Warrior previously, or perhaps intend to do so in the future, it's an aircraft well worth considering. Nice to see that once again Just Flight are offering a discount to previous owners of the aircraft from P3D and FSX, and you can also secure the same 25% discount if you purchase the Arrow for Microsoft Flight Simulator. Overall, I really enjoyed my time out in the Warrior. I'm certainly very happy to now have the aircraft in my virtual hangar. And I think that once again, for the time being, Just Flight proving that they are the gold standard when it comes to general aviation aircraft within Microsoft Flight Simulator. Anyway guys, thank you very much once again for watching. As always, if you enjoyed the video or found it to be of use, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comment section below, and I'll always do my best to answer them. And I'd like to say a big thank you once again to my channel members and patrons. So Abby, Peter, Mark, Godseeker, Paul, John and Bloke75, thank you ever so much for your support. And indeed thank you to everybody who supports the channel, whether that's through subscribing or watching the content. Take care guys, thank you very much, and I'll see you all again soon.